A flight attendant scratched a black CEO's face with his keys. He had no idea that moment would unlock his own downfall. He thought dragging a key across a man's face would leave him powerless. He didn't realize the one he scarred could turn pain into precision. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always unlocks its own downfall. The edge of the key sliced through Marcus Wynn's cheek like a whisper of metal against skin. A quiet gasp fluttered through the air, but no one moved. Time seemed to pause in that narrow aisle between seats 1C and 2A. The dull clink of the key retracting back into the flight attendant's lanyard echoed louder than it should have. Marcus blinked once, then again. The sharp sting bloomed seconds later, slow, deliberate, like heat trailing behind a lightning strike. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. But the thin stream of blood that curved down his jawline told the cabin what his pride refused to admit. Something had just happened. Something that would not be forgotten. Ryland Dorr, the flight attendant, now looming half a step too close, tilted his head and offered a hollow smirk. "Didn't mean to, sir," he said, voice slick with artificial concern. But Marcus saw the truth glimmering behind the man's eyes, like someone who had just knocked over a glass on purpose and was already planning to blame the table. Marcus slowly reached for the napkin Ryland had extended a second earlier. The corner was still crisp, untouched, useless. He didn't take it. Instead, he turned to the armrest and calmly retrieved a folded linen handkerchief from his blazer. With practiced elegance, he pressed the soft white cloth to his cheek and let the red soak in. The cabin murmured back to life. A baby, 2 rows behind, resumed crying. Someone coughed, twice, forced and awkward. The lights above flickered with turbulence as the aircraft rolled gently along its path, but none of it could shake the gravity now hanging around seat 2A like a fog. Ryland took a half-step back. His posture remained upright, but his confidence wavered. "Bit of a close call there," he added quickly, but his gaze darted sideways, checking to see who might be watching. Marcus didn't look up. He didn't give Ryland the satisfaction. Instead, he dabbed the wound again, eyes fixed on his tablet screen. Not reading, just focusing, calculating. Inside his mind, a clock began ticking. He remembered Ryland's earlier sneer when Marcus had politely asked for help with the jammed seatbelt. "You people always want special treatment," the man had muttered under his breath. It wasn't loud enough to be heard by anyone else, but Marcus had stored it away, catalogued it like every veiled slight he'd endured across his career. The cut wasn't deep, but it was deliberate. The hand hadn't trembled. The trajectory wasn't accidental. Marcus had lived long enough in boardrooms and war zones of language to know when a move was calculated. And this one had been dressed up as a mistake, tied with a bow of plausible deniability. A thin line of blood now touched the collar of Marcus's pale blue shirt. He calmly unfolded his tablet case and used the reflection of the screen to examine the cut. It glinted back at him, a reminder not of injury, but of opportunity. He tapped the camera app, snapped a photo, then another. The napkin Ryland had offered still lay untouched on the armrest, symbolic, sterile, and unused, like the apology that came with it. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man with reading glasses looked up from his paperback, brow knitting at the sight of blood. A younger man in the bulkhead row leaned sideways to whisper to his companion. 2 teenage boys, 3 rows behind, discreetly angled their phones. Ryland stood awkwardly beside the beverage cart, pretending to arrange cups, but his eyes kept flicking toward Marcus, now beginning to sense the tide shifting. Marcus leaned back in his seat and finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "You should be more careful," he said without looking up. Ryland cleared his throat. Turbulence. Nothing more. Marcus turned slowly, folding the blood-stained handkerchief in half with perfect precision. He met Ryland's gaze head-on, unblinking, cold, quiet. His words floated out like a verdict. "You're right. Turbulence does strange things." The flight attendant's lips tightened into a line. His hands were no longer steady as he poured water into another passenger's cup. Marcus resumed typing on his tablet, not notes for the board meeting he was headed to, but details, documentation, witness rows, time of incident, exact position of the key on the lanyard, the angle of the scrape, tone of voice, facial expression, every piece of the puzzle being assembled while his pulse remained even and his expression unreadable. He wasn't a man who acted from emotion. Marcus Wynne had built Cinecore systems from the ground up in boardrooms filled with people who smiled like Rylan and stabbed like that key. His strength had never been in outrage. It had always been in response. Let them think it was a mistake, he thought. Let them believe I'll file a complaint, write an angry email, and move on. But Marcus Wynne never moved on. He moved through. The captain's voice crackled from the intercom, announcing mild turbulence ahead and asking passengers to remain seated. The moment passed like a shadow sweeping across the cabin. But something had already changed. Marcus dabbed the last of the blood and refolded the cloth again. This time, he tucked it into the inner pocket of his blazer, not to forget, but to preserve. His jaw clenched slightly as the sting returned, raw against the recycled air. Rylan passed again, slower this time, careful to stay out of reach, but Marcus turned, just slightly, and whispered loud enough for only Rylan to hear. "Whatever you think this was," he said, "it wasn't just a scratch." Rylan didn't respond. Marcus leaned back into his seat, calm as ever. The window beside him reflected a silver streak of clouds on the horizon. But in his mind, the storm had already begun. That scratch, he thought, just unlocked something far deeper than he realized. The sting from the key was still fresh. Marcus Wynne didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even move, at least not at first. He sat upright in his seat, eyes locked on Rylan Dorr, the flight attendant who had just sliced his cheek open with the edge of his lanyard key. A thin line of blood traced the curve of Marcus's face, catching the cabin lights as they flickered with a soft hum, turbulence gently rocking the aircraft like an uncertain breath. The silence around them wasn't peace, it was a vacuum, full of gasps that hadn't yet escaped. Marcus moved slowly, deliberately. He reached into his blazer and pulled out a folded white handkerchief. Dabbing the blood without looking away from Rylan, he applied just enough pressure to stop the bleeding, not to erase the mark. He wanted the line visible, for now. Across the aisle, a man in his late 40s wearing a navy sweater looked over, brow furrowed. Dr. Conrad Lyle, a respected epidemiologist known for his calm and observational nature, tilted his head slightly as he took in the scratch. He didn't speak, but the disapproval was written across his face. He had seen what happened, or at least he had seen enough. Rylan, meanwhile, had already begun to distance himself from the act. He turned away briskly, muttering apologies to himself more than to anyone else, fumbling with the drink cart like it held secrets he needed to bury. He reached for a packet of pretzels, then for a napkin, then changed his mind, the items clattering faintly as he moved with uncharacteristic clumsiness. His hands were shaking, just enough to betray the fear trying to hide beneath his forced routine. Marcus's thoughts moved faster than his body. "No need to make a scene," he whispered under his breath, his voice so quiet it blended with the low rumble of the engines. But in his mind, pieces were already falling into place. He remembered a section in his corporate protection clause, Section 4.3.1, he recalled precisely, covering incidents of public humiliation or unprovoked aggression, not just physical injury, but reputational risk. And reputation was everything for a man like him. He opened the camera app on his tablet and held it still, angled slightly toward his reflection in the dark window beside him. The scratch was clear, bold against the contrast of his dark skin and the crisp white of his collar. He took 3 photos, one straight on, one close up, and one from a slight angle showing the blood-stained handkerchief in his hand. The shutter clicks were soft but purposeful, like the cocking of a quiet gun. He saved them to a folder titled Incident 23B and synced them to a secure drive. His fingers moved to the Notes app next. He typed with his thumb in neat lines, cabin crew member, Ryland door, object, silver key on airline-issued lanyard, event, 1312, key drawn across face, no verbal warning, response, mocking grin, no apology. Witness, row 3, AA, male passenger, early 40s, navy sweater, glasses. Each word was placed with intention. This wasn't paranoia, it was precision. Marcus hadn't built Cinecore systems by letting things slip through cracks. He had trained himself to turn moments like this into leverage, pain into planning. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged softly as it turned off. A few passengers shifted, stretching their legs or pulling laptops from bags. Ryland returned like a shadow, trying to maintain the illusion of control. "If you'd like to file a report, you can do that after landing," he said stiffly, his voice higher than before, his words clipped. Marcus looked up slowly, the blood now drying in a thin crust on his skin. His eyes didn't blink. "You just did," he said. Ryland blinked in confusion. "Excuse me?" Marcus offered a faint smile, the kind that made people nervous. "You said I could file a report after landing, but what you don't know is that your report began the moment you chose to act." Ryland swallowed. "It was an accident." "I know what an accident looks like," Marcus replied calmly. "You leaned in with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from clumsiness. It comes from comfort, the kind of comfort people gain when they believe there are no consequences." For a moment, the cabin seemed to grow colder. Ryland stood frozen, caught between defending himself and retreating. His fingers twitched at his side, the silver key still dangling against his thigh like a guilty ornament. Dr. Lyle shifted again in his seat, clearly listening now. Behind him, another man, a young professional in a charcoal suit, lowered his phone discreetly after recording. The whisper of suspicion was spreading like slow fire. The tension wasn't just between Marcus and Ryland anymore. It had bloomed into the space around them, wrapping itself around the silence of a dozen passengers who now knew they had witnessed something more than rudeness. Marcus leaned back into his seat, folding his handkerchief neatly across his lap. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. The scratch would heal. But the moment, the evidence, the intention, the arrogance, it would leave a scar somewhere far deeper, one that wouldn't fade. Ryland backed away, muttering again under his breath. He couldn't tell whether Marcus had planned this reaction or if he was just incredibly skilled at handling escalation. Either way, it unnerved him. The flicker of overhead lights returned briefly. Another patch of turbulence passed, but this time the jolt didn't move Marcus. His stillness became a statement. The flight would continue, but Ryland knew something irreversible had started. He thought he scratched a face, but he'd just carved his own fate. Ryland Dorr's footsteps quickened as he moved down the aisle, his polished black shoes clicking just a little too fast against the cabin floor. His posture had changed. Gone was the lazy confidence he wore like a second uniform. In its place, fidgeting hands, darting glances, shoulders that refused to square. He leaned in close to Caleb Vaughan, the younger flight attendant who had just emerged from the galley, and whispered something clipped and urgent. Caleb gave a subtle nod but glanced toward Marcus with a flicker of concern in his eyes. It was clear he didn't like what he was hearing. Marcus Wynne didn't move. He sat back in his seat, legs crossed, one hand resting over the soft leather armrest, the other gently wiping the dried blood from his cheek with a cloth he had folded 3 precise times. His tablet rested on his lap, still glowing faintly from the screen capture he'd taken earlier. Though his face remained composed, his eyes were quietly measuring everything. Angles, reactions, tensions. Every detail was being stored with surgical accuracy. To an outside observer, it might have looked like nothing was happening. Just another smooth flight interrupted briefly by turbulence. Passengers buried their faces in paperback thrillers and travel magazines, but several had begun recording the cabin discreetly, holding phones low in their laps or propping them against armrests. They sensed something was off. The hum of the engine became a backdrop to something far more volatile. Marcus closed his eyes, just for a moment, but not to rest. In the dark behind his lids, he replayed the motion again. Rylan leaning in, the silver glint of the key, the direction of the scratch, the timing of his smirk, the quiet curl of satisfaction behind his teeth. These were not the motions of someone caught off guard. These were decisions, calculated and cruel. A deliberate movement cloaked in customer service. He wasn't just slashed, he was marked. The captain's voice cracked through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be hitting a small patch of turbulence in the next 10 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The seatbelt light chimed softly overhead. Marcus exhaled slowly. He had faced worse turbulence in boardrooms, in closed-door policy negotiations, in moments of moral standstill where silence was weaponized. This, however, felt different. This turbulence wasn't caused by clouds or pressure systems. This one was man-made. He slipped off his navy blazer with deliberate ease, folding it neatly on his lap. Underneath, the edge of an old scar near his collarbone caught the sterile cabin light. A thin, faded line, remnant from a protest march 15 years ago in Newbarrow. Back then, it was a baton that struck him. Now, it was a key. Different instruments. Same intent. The memory grounded him. Restraint was not a sign of weakness. It was the measured pause before precision. Marcus opened his eyes again. Rylan passed by slowly, pretending to check the overhead bins, but his eyes kept flicking toward Marcus. There was something new behind them now. Not disdain, but fear, trying hard not to look like fear. "You seem nervous," Marcus said, voice low but unmistakable. Rylan stopped short, his face going pale. "No, sir," he muttered, adjusting his collar. "Just doing my job." Marcus leaned forward, just slightly, until his words met Rylan's ear in a private radius. "Then you might want to start doing it right." For a heartbeat, everything stilled. Even the engine's thrum seemed to dip into a lower register. The flight attendant stood frozen in place, his hands clenched just tightly enough to turn his knuckles pale. Behind him, Caleb observed quietly, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. Marcus leaned back again, crossing one leg over the other, never breaking eye contact. The air shifted. Something unseen tightened around them, something heavier than recycled oxygen. It was anticipation, thick and growing. Several rows down, a passenger set down his drink without sipping. Another angled her phone subtly toward the aisle. No one dared speak, but everyone was listening. Rylan gave a stiff nod and turned away, quickly vanishing toward the galley. His footsteps, this time, did not click. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of what wasn't said, what had been provoked, what had been revealed. The invisible thread that held civility together had frayed. Marcus didn't need to shout, or stand, or strike back. His words had already sliced deeper than retaliation ever could. He touched the cloth to his cheek once more. The blood had stopped, but the impression lingered. His hand brushed the scar again beneath his collarbone, old pain meeting new. This wasn't over. This was the beginning. And then, with a stillness sharper than any blade, Marcus whispered again, barely audible but utterly certain. "Sometimes, silence cuts deeper than any key." The sting deepened. The recycled cabin air, chilled and dry, gnawed at the fresh wound on Marcus Wynn's cheek. It wasn't the pain that clenched his jaw, though. It was the memory. The memory of how quickly arrogance turned to cruelty, and how many had stayed silent when it did. He didn't flinch. Instead, with calm deliberation, Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a slim silver pen. The kind of pen that wasn't meant for signing autographs or scribbling grocery lists. It was the kind of pen a strategist carried. one that had inked contracts, severed deals, and written memos that reshaped entire divisions. Now, it would serve a different purpose. He unfastened his left cuff and began writing on the fabric, one precise line at a time. The letters were small but bold, pressed firmly into the cotton. Witnesses, row 3. Left side. Key, silver, chain lanyard. Intentional, tone, mocking. The turbulence had settled, but tension coiled tighter in the air. Every time Marcus shifted, he felt eyes on him. Some curious, others cautious. He didn't care. His mind had locked into a rhythm, the kind that always preceded action. From the corner of his eye, he spotted movement. Ryland Dorr, the flight attendant whose smirk had been sharper than the key itself, fumbled with a tray of snack boxes in the aisle. His hands trembled. The tray tilted. Crackers and pretzels scattered across the aisle like dropped playing cards. A small carton of apple juice hit the floor and rolled under a seat. Senior flight attendant Nolan Crest approached with a clipped stride. Taller than Rylan and a few years older, Nolan exuded the type of authority Rylan only pretended to have. He leaned in sharply, voice low but stern. "Focus," Nolan muttered. "One more mess like that, and you'll answer for it." Rylan barely nodded, face pale, sweat beading near his temples. Nolan turned toward Marcus, catching sight of the red line across his cheek. His brows creased as he stepped closer. "Sir," he said cautiously, "would you like to file a formal incident report?" Marcus met his eyes, calm, unwavering. He tapped his tablet, where a tiny blue light blinked steadily. The recording had never stopped. "I already have," Marcus replied. Nolan's eyes dropped to the device. Realization flickered in his gaze. That wasn't just a blinking light, it was a warning beacon. His confusion shifted to concern, then to something darker, fear. A beat of silence passed between them. Then came the hiss of a whisper behind Nolan. "You're overreacting," Ryland said bitterly, stepping forward with flushed cheeks and clenched fists. His voice was sharper now, defensive. "It was a mistake, okay? You're turning this into something it's not." Marcus turned slowly, his posture still relaxed but his eyes narrowing just slightly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move quickly. Instead, he reached up, loosened his navy silk tie with one hand, and slid it from his collar with quiet precision. "If I were overreacting," Marcus said, his tone measured and steady, "you'd already be on the floor." The words hit harder than any shout could have. A ripple went through the nearby passengers. Some gasped quietly, others froze mid-motion. Phones were out now, discreetly angled but recording nonetheless. The cabin had become a theater, and Marcus, without ever trying, had taken center stage. Then, without warning, Marcus bent down. On the floor, near the base of seat 2B, lay the same silver key Rylan had worn around his neck. Somehow, in the chaos of the snack spill, it had slipped free from his lanyard. Marcus picked it up, holding it between two fingers like a scalpel. He looked at Rylan once more. Then, slowly and with deliberate force, he raised the key and pressed it against his own chest. The first button on his shirt snapped free with a metallic pop, then the second, then the third. Passengers gasped. One man in row 4 dropped his earbuds. A child in row 5 stared, wide-eyed. No one moved. No one spoke. The tension had hardened into silence. Marcus didn't stop until every button along the front of his crisp white shirt had been torn open. The fabric hung loosely at his sides, exposing his chest, marked with a faint scar near his collarbone, and, now, the long red scratch that glared beneath his cheek like a twin wound. The key glinted in his hand, still held tightly. "You opened my face," Marcus said, voice low and certain, "so I'll open your truth." The sharp snap of thread echoed louder than expected. Buttons clattered to the floor one by one, each bounce marking a shift in the cabin's energy. Marcus Wynne stood still in the aisle, fingers slowly pulling the silver key downward, slicing through his shirt with deliberate precision. His face remained unreadable, but the tension, like the tightening of wires above a stage just before they snap, spread outward in invisible waves. Passengers turned in their seats, breath held. The low hum of the aircraft was suddenly louder than ever, a backdrop to something none of them had expected to witness. Ryland Dorr froze mid-step. The key he'd used earlier now dangled uselessly from his lanyard, no longer a tool of control, but a symbol of unraveling authority. His lips parted, but no words came. Behind him, Nolan Crest, the senior flight attendant, rushed forward, his hands outstretched in a calming gesture. "Gentlemen, please," he began, voice coated in corporate urgency. "This needs to de-escalate." But Marcus didn't even look at him. He raised his voice, not in anger, but in a tone that cut through the recycled air like sharpened steel. "This isn't about a scratch." The cabin went still. His shirt, now hanging loose, revealed the faint red marks across his chest, lines that echoed the fresh slash on his cheek. The visual was arresting. His blood had dried slightly, leaving behind a jagged trail along his jawline, yet the wound was nothing compared to what his presence now inflicted on the confidence of the crew. "It's about power," Marcus continued, stepping forward slowly, 1 foot at a time, eyes locked on Rylan. "And who thinks they have it?" Rylan took a step back, bumping into the beverage cart he'd abandoned earlier. A sharp metallic rattle escaped as a glass tipped over and rolled. He grabbed the edge of the cart like a lifeline, sweat now dotting his forehead. His badge hung crooked across his chest, and for the first time that flight he looked not like crew, but like prey. A young voice rose behind Marcus. "Rylan," Caleb Vaughan said quietly from mid-cabin, "you went too far this time." Caleb's words landed like a dropped gavel. A beat of silence passed, then another. Rylan turned toward him in disbelief, eyes wide. But Caleb didn't flinch. He stood with his hands by his sides, face firm. The fracture within the crew had become visible. Passengers whispered among themselves. Several held up their phones, no longer bothering to hide them. Some had started recording the moment Marcus stood. Others had been filming long before. A man near row 5 slowly turned his screen, revealing a live stream interface. The red dot blinked steadily, but Marcus was ahead of them. Tucked into the seat pocket in front of 2A, his tablet blinked quietly. A tiny blue light indicated it was transmitting. The footage, from the keys slash to the shirt's tearing, had already been encrypted and uploaded to a secure server. Back at his headquarters, his assistant Damon would have received the signal. The same Damon who designed Synercor's crisis management software after a data breach scandal 2 years prior. The same Damon who built a network of encrypted backups, legal, public, and private. That system now carried Marcus's live feed to at least 12 off-site recipients, including his legal counsel, crisis comms team, and the FAA oversight monitor they had on retainer. Caleb stepped aside as Marcus slowly returned to his seat, every motion graceful, not rushed. The murmurs in the cabin didn't die. They multiplied. A woman covered her mouth. A teenage boy nudged his father and whispered, "Is that the guy from the ethics reform thing last year?" Another man muttered, "That's Marcus Wynn, the Synercor CEO." Marcus sat upright, unbuttoned shirt framing his body like a statement, not a flaw. His eyes didn't scan the room, they aimed. One passenger offered him tissues, but he held up a hand, palm open. "Thank you," he said softly, "but I'll keep the evidence as is." Nolan, watching helplessly, approached again. "Sir, please, I'd strongly advise—" Marcus cut him off gently, his tone respectful but final. "Mr. Crest, this is beyond advice." From the cockpit, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're requesting calm in the forward cabin area. Please remain seated. Flight attendants secure the aisle," but no one moved. Not yet. Rylan, trembling, finally found his voice. "You're overreacting," he said. almost choking on the words. It wasn't on purpose. I didn't mean to. Marcus tilted his head, his gaze still fixed on him. If I were overreacting, he said with unnerving calm, you'd already be on the floor. The sentence dropped like lead. And then, in an act no one saw coming, Marcus bent down beside his seat and picked up something small and silver. Ryland's key. The very one that had sliced his skin moments ago. Ryland's mouth opened slightly, instinctively stepping forward, but Marcus raised a single hand. Don't, he said. He stood again. Every eye followed him. With care, Marcus lifted the key and pressed it against his chest, not to harm, but to make a point. Then, with slow deliberation, he ran it downward, tearing through the remaining buttons, opening the shirt completely. The cotton split open like paper, baring the full expanse of his chest, red lines, old scars, and fresh defiance all on display. Gasps swept the aisle. You opened my face, Marcus said, voice low but resonant. So, I'll open your truth. Passengers didn't clap. They didn't speak. They simply stared, phones recording, breath caught in their throats, as if they had just witnessed a man carve a message into the very fabric of injustice. In that moment, Marcus Wynne wasn't just a CEO. He was a storm given form. He turned, returning to his seat once more, calm settling across him like armor. He stared straight ahead, eyes distant but sharp, while Ryland shrank behind the galley curtain, stripped of pride, stripped of pretense. The captain repeated the call for calm, but the damage was done. No turbulence could match the force of what had unfolded midair. The passengers were no longer just travelers, they were witnesses. And as the hush settled in, Marcus spoke one last sentence. His voice didn't need volume, it carried because it was true. Keys open doors, but they also unlock consequences. Ryland backed away from the aisle like a man stepping off a cliff he hadn't seen until too late. The panic began in his chest, a prickling heat that rose up his throat and flushed his face red. He hadn't just scratched a random traveler. He hadn't just made an error in judgment. He had marked Marcus Wynne. And now the blood on that man's face felt less like a wound and more like a verdict. He stumbled into the narrow galley, brushing past the drink cart, nearly knocking over a tray of empty cups. His fingers dug into the counter's edge for balance. His voice cracked as he turned to Nolan, who was reorganizing cutlery with the calm of someone trying very hard not to react. I need to explain what happened, Ryland whispered. Nolan didn't look at him. He set down a metal stir slowly, deliberately. Don't, he replied flatly. No, it was an accident. Nolan's eyes finally met his, steady and unreadable. Then you should have acted like it the moment it happened. Nott smiled. Ryland's breath faltered. He couldn't argue with that. Couldn't explain the impulse that had surged through him. Just a moment of irritation, of arrogance, of wanting to put a man in his place. But now that moment had stretched into something monstrous. In the main cabin, Marcus remained seated, unmoved by the noise. His shirt hung open where he had ripped the buttons with a symbolic calm that still sent shockwaves through the passengers. The wound on his cheek had dried into a deep red streak, running diagonally toward his collarbone where more faded lines from his past seemed to echo the new injury. A man in row 3 leaned forward, quietly offering a packet of tissues. Marcus accepted it with a polite nod but didn't use it. Thank you, he said, voice low, but I'll keep the evidence as is. He placed the tissues gently on his lap and instead reached for his tablet. One finger tapped the glass, unlocking the screen with a quick scan. A small red icon glowed in the corner, indicating the recording was still active. He didn't smile. His expression remained still, neutral, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had already measured the next 5 steps. Marcus began typing. Upload all footage to secure cloud. Contact Crane Law. Seconds passed. A soft buzz. A reply appeared on screen from his assistant, Damon. Already done. He tilted the screen slightly and closed the folio case. Across the aisle, a man stared at him, then quickly turned away, pretending to study the safety instructions. But Marcus wasn't looking for allies. He was looking for accountability. Back in the galley, Rylan paced in a tight circle, his thumb nervously rubbing the edge of his lanyard where the key once dangled. He had dropped it earlier. Nolan hadn't returned it. He didn't ask. "Is he doing anything?" Rylan finally muttered. "Recording," Nolan replied. Rylan froze. "Still." Nolan's head barely moved, but the answer was clear. Yes, and it wasn't just Marcus who had captured it. Passengers, too. The glare of camera phones had flickered like stars throughout the cabin when Marcus stood. What Rylan had tried to write off as a moment of authority had become a cascade of evidence. A slow, relentless unraveling. Marcus adjusted his seat, resting back with quiet control, but his eyes remained sharp. Watching. Thinking. Calculating. He hadn't reacted in rage, and that's what made it worse. The absence of fury revealed something more dangerous. A man familiar with conflict and well-versed in dismantling it, layer by layer. In the galley's doorway, Rylan parted the curtain slightly and peeked out. Marcus was watching. Their eyes met. And in that moment, something shifted in Rylan's spine. It wasn't pain or fear. It was exposure. The unbearable weight of being seen not as a steward of safety, but as the instigator of harm. He let the curtain fall shut. Marcus turned his gaze back toward the window. The clouds outside stretched endlessly, indifferent to the events unfolding beneath them. The hum of the engine, the soft pings of the overhead notifications, it all continued, a strange normalcy laid over a deep fracture. He reached into the front pocket of his blazer and pulled out a slim leather case. Opening it revealed a series of sealed sleeves, each one for sensitive materials, labeled and indexed. He slid the scratched key he had retrieved earlier into one marked Evidence, to A Incident. With a quiet zip, he resealed the case and placed it beside him. He knew this moment was only the beginning. The PR fallout, the legal reports, the formal complaints, they would come. But this moment of eerie stillness was where the real shift began, where fear whispered behind curtains and dignity sat quietly in an open seat, refusing to hide. Marcus folded his hands in his lap, exhaled once through his nose, and let the silence grow. Behind the curtain, Rylan pressed his back to the wall. Sweat darkened the edges of his collar. Every engine vibration now felt like a warning, a tremor, a consequence. And through it all, one thought looped in Marcus's mind, not as anger, but as clarity. When fear wears a uniform, he thought, justice wears patience. The aircraft jolted as a wave of turbulence struck, sending a shiver through overhead compartments and rattling the tray tables. Cups slid an inch forward. A few passengers gasped quietly and gripped their armrests. But amid the shifting metal and vibrating air, a subtler collapse was taking place, one not caused by weather, but by fear. Rylan Dorr stood near the beverage cart, shoulders stiff, face pale, fists clenched so tightly around a silver keychain that the metal dug into his palm. Sweat collected along his temples. His voice was sharp and low as he leaned toward the senior flight attendant, Nolan Crest. "He's lying," Rylan hissed, darting a glance over his shoulder toward seat 2A. "It was an accident." Nolan's expression was unreadable. Years of managing high-stress flights had made his face a mask of professionalism, but his jaw flexed once, tight, controlled. He had seen the blood, had heard the murmurs circling the cabin like a rising storm. His tone was clipped. "Rylan, think very carefully before you keep talking." Behind them, another crew member stood silently, Caleb Vorn. Younger, more reserved, but his eyes were steady. He took a step closer, his voice calm but resolute. "No, it wasn't." The three words landed like weight on Rylan's shoulders. He flinched slightly, and for a moment, the key trembled in his grip. The noise of the plane receded under the pressure of that single statement. The cabin, though bustling with murmurs and whispers, seemed to still around them. Just a few rows ahead, Marcus Wynne sat motionless, his body relaxed but alert, as if waiting for a specific signal to act. He had heard everything. His hand rested near his seat arm, holding a slim, pen-shaped voice recorder. With a quiet flick, he reactivated the device. The red light blinked once. In legal terms, the contradiction Caleb had just delivered was invaluable. A direct rebuttal from a fellow staff member. Not only was it damning, it was time-stamped. Nolan broke the silence. "Did you see it happen?" Caleb hesitated, but then nodded. "I saw enough to know he aimed that key too close." And he didn't look sorry Marcus didn't move. He didn't need to. Every moment was unfolding exactly as he expected, like a chessboard where the opponent realized too late that the king was already cornered. Nolan ran a hand through his hair, processing what was unraveling. "You know who that man is?" he asked quietly. Rylan didn't answer, but Marcus did. He stood without urgency, adjusted the cuffs of his half-torn shirt, and stepped into the aisle. Passengers parted subtly, their eyes fixed on him. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to touch. Nolan turned toward him, ready to extend an olive branch, but Marcus spoke first. His voice was low, polished, and unmistakably controlled. "No need for discussion, Mr. Crest." He reached into his inside jacket pocket and drew out a card. White, embossed, simple. He handed it to Nolan, who accepted it without comment until he read the name. Wynne Strategic Holdings. Recognition flickered in Nolan's eyes like a blown fuse. He had heard that name. A segment on ethical reform in corporate America. A profile on a man who had turned whistleblowers into legends. Marcus Wynne wasn't just another passenger. He was a reckoning in tailored clothing. "Your captain should prepare a statement," Marcus continued, "and your legal team should be ready. My counsel will be in touch." Ryland's mouth opened slightly as if to interject, but no words came. Instead, he clutched the key tighter, pressing it into his skin, as if, somehow, by holding on to it, he could keep control. Caleb watched him closely, his arms folded, not in judgment, but with a silent kind of finality. The truth had spoken. There was no going back. Meanwhile, Marcus remained composed. The eyes of several passengers now lingered longer, and a few began whispering to one another. Phones reappeared in hands. The events of the flight, once private, had become public spectacle, and Marcus had made no misstep. Every reaction, every gesture had been deliberate. He turned his gaze toward Rylan, slow and precise. The young man's face was flushed now, beads of sweat running down his jawline. He took an uncertain step back, bumping into the edge of the beverage cart. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You used that key to open my skin," he said, his tone as calm as still water. He paused. The silence made the next line pierce deeper. "But I'm about to use it to unlock your entire chain of command." He scraped a jagged key across the CEO's cheek, grinning as blood traced down his collar. "If you believe power without respect is nothing but weakness, hit subscribe now, because justice doesn't beg, it reveals." The captain's voice crackled through the cabin speakers announcing the final descent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please return to your seats and ensure all carry-on items are secured." The cabin jolted slightly as the aircraft began its gradual descent, but no one moved. The tension, like heavy fog, sat thick in the aisle. Every passenger could feel it, an invisible line drawn between what had happened and what was coming. In row 2A, Marcus Wynne sat still, collected, fastening the remaining buttons of his torn shirt with careful precision. Across the aisle, Ryland Dorr remained frozen, sweat lining his forehead. He had been ordered by Nolan Crest, the senior attendant, to stay seated until touchdown. The uniform he wore looked more like a cage now. Its authority evaporated. His hands gripped the sides of his seat as if bracing for impact, but the crash wasn't in the landing gear. It was in the fallout he knew was coming. Marcus reached into his briefcase with methodical calm and retrieved a small, clear plastic pouch. Without hesitation, he placed the key, still carrying traces of dried blood, inside and sealed it. The label, handwritten in tidy ink, read, Exhibit A. He held it between his fingers for a moment, then set it beside his tablet. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone who watched. It was no longer a key. It was evidence. The aircraft tilted again, wings adjusting to wind. Marcus stared out the small window, the lights of the city below flickering like distant thoughts. But his mind wasn't on the view. It was on the precision of what would follow. His assistant, Damon, had already contacted the authorities. The flight's real descent wasn't just altitude, it was toward consequence. Behind the curtain of the forward galley, Nolan whispered fiercely to Rylan. "You understand the gravity of this, right?" Rylan's voice cracked. "It was an accident." "You said that 3 times already," Nolan muttered, jaw clenched. "But he's got recordings. Witnesses. And you smiled, Rylan. People saw it." Rylan opened his mouth, but no words came. Just a shallow breath and a frightened stare toward the front of the cabin where Marcus sat like a storm that had already passed, but left a wreckage behind. The seatbelt sign chimed again. Flight attendants gave final instructions, their voices robotic now, hollow with dread. Trays clattered as they were locked into place. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to keep pretending nothing had happened, or brace for the moment they'd later recount to reporters, friends, maybe lawyers. Wheels screeched against the runway. Touchdown. The plane slowed, the hum of the engine softening into a drag of anticipation. The moment the aircraft halted at the gate, the cabin filled with the familiar rustle of seatbelts unlatching, but the crew's voice interrupted. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for a brief moment. We appreciate your cooperation." That wasn't routine. That was protocol. Security was on its way. 2 figures in dark uniforms boarded swiftly from the jet bridge, airport officers, professional and unsmiling. They moved with quiet authority, scanning the rows until Nolan gestured discreetly toward Rylan. The young flight attendant turned pale. "I didn't mean—" "You'll have a chance to speak," one officer said firmly, motioning for him to rise. Passengers began recording, their cameras catching every word, every expression. The damage wasn't just legal now, it was viral. The story was already halfway out the door. Rylan's voice rose. "It was an accident, I swear." He stumbled in his speech, his hands open as if hoping someone, anyone, would agree. But the cabin was silent. Not even Caleb Vaughan, the junior attendant who had once stood beside him, came to his defense. The officers stepped forward and escorted Rylan down the aisle, past eyes that would remember his face more clearly than any boarding pass. And then came the sound. Not applause, not shouting, just the soft, deliberate click of Marcus Wynn's shoes on the cabin floor. He rose slowly, retrieved his briefcase, and walked forward, past row after row of now silent travelers, each bearing witness to a reckoning. In his left hand, the plastic pouch rattled gently, the key inside catching the light like a blade dulled by justice. He didn't look at Rylan, didn't speak, but the power of his silence said everything. As he stepped off the plane, flanked by airport officials who deferred to him as if he were already in charge of the investigation, his thoughts remained steady. He didn't rush. He didn't gloat. He just moved forward, each step measured like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Behind him, the plane sat quiet, its cabin finally exhaling the breath it had been holding since the moment metal had met skin. And just before he disappeared into the private terminal hall, Marcus let one final thought settle in his mind like a seal pressed to paper. Sometimes, he thought, justice lands smoother than the plane that carried it. The door clicked shut behind Marcus with a hollow finality. Inside the small, fluorescent-lit conference room, the air felt too still, like the moment before a storm when birds go quiet. Across the table sat 4 men in dark suits, their name badges clipped neatly to their lapels as if formality could shield them from consequence. At the head of the table was Darren Cole, the airline's legal director, flanked by 2 corporate advisors and the chief of cabin operations, Malcolm Pierce. Each of them wore the same tight-lipped expression, a blend of cautious professionalism and barely veiled anxiety. They had rehearsed for this, but not for him. Marcus Wynn didn't bother to sit right away. He placed his slim black briefcase gently on the table, opened it with the precision of a surgeon, and removed a tablet, a small silver pouch, and a leather-bound notepad. The pouch held the key, Ryland Dorr's key, that had slashed his face. It rested between them now, sealed and labeled like a piece of evidence at trial. The cut on his cheek, though healing, still carried a faint red trace, a symbol, a wound that spoke louder than words. Darren Cole cleared his throat. "Mr. Wynn," he began, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We deeply regret the misunderstanding that occurred on board Flight 217. It's not reflective of our values." Marcus's eyes met his, unmoved. "Call it what it was, assault. Then we can talk." The silence that followed cut sharper than the key had. Darren's smile faltered, the plastic mask of diplomacy beginning to crack. Malcolm shifted in his chair, glancing at the others as if hoping someone would intervene. No one did. Marcus tapped on his tablet, the screen brightening to show a paused frame of Ryland's smirking face, taken moments after the scratch. "You've had 12 hours to get your terminology straight," he said quietly. "I suggest you use the right words moving forward." He pressed play. The video played without commentary, just the raw moment. The scratch, the smirk, the whispered taunt, the blood. The room watched in uncomfortable silence. One of the advisors looked away. Malcolm Pierce rubbed his temple. When the footage ended, Marcus continued with unshakable calm. "That's time-stamped. Synced to a secure cloud within 30 seconds of capture. There are 6 witness recordings matching the sequence, 3 passenger testimonies already notarized, and an audio file of your staff attempting to minimize the event before landing." He laid out each document in front of him, sliding them forward like chess pieces. Darren reached for one but paused mid-air, his fingers hesitating as if the paper might burn. "We'd like to resolve this quickly," Darren said, voice tighter now. "We're prepared to offer a—" Marcus didn't let him finish. "There will be no quick resolution. I've already filed a criminal report for aggravated harassment and battery. My attorneys are filing civil charges within the hour." The room shifted again. The advisors straightened. Malcolm leaned forward, finally speaking. "Mr. Wynn, we understand your frustration." This was a rare lapse. "We assure you," Marcus leaned in too, his voice lower but far more powerful. "Lapses end with lessons. This one will end with reform." The news broke before sunrise. Marcus Wynn was still reviewing a preliminary draft of his legal complaint when his phone buzzed relentlessly on the polished oak table beside him. Dozens of alerts poured in, news sites, email pings, encrypted messages from internal advisors. A single headline climbed to the top of every feed. "CEO assaulted mid-flight. Airline under fire for staff misconduct." The words hit like a second impact, but this time, Marcus was ready. Across the city, in a dimly lit media conference room at Fairwing Airlines headquarters, silence fell like a curtain over a wall of executives. Screens displayed the same headline in different languages. One window showed paused footage from the flight, Marcus's shirt torn open, blood still visible across his cheek. Another showed him calmly passing a sealed key into a plastic evidence pouch while passengers looked on. Ryland Dorr's face never appeared again after that day. Within hours of the story going viral, the airline issued a bland statement announcing his termination. But it didn't stop the bleeding, because the scratch was only the surface. An anonymous leak arrived just before noon. Internal chat logs. Dozens of them. Marcus's legal advisor, Daniel Crane, slid the printouts across the table during their strategy session. "You're going to want to read this carefully," he said, his voice measured but his jaw tight. Marcus scanned the documents. The first message was time-stamped 2 months prior. Rylan Dorr. Another diamond-tier guest today. Looked like he stole the card from someone's wallet. These people think money buys manners. The second, Rylan Dorr. One more seatbelt request from one of these privileged heroes, and I'm going to lose it. Might accidentally give someone a reality check message after message, the tone sharpened. Racist remarks, thinly veiled threats, inside jokes between crew members who enabled him. None of them reprimanded. None flagged. Some even laughed along. Marcus looked up from the pages. "This wasn't a crack in the system," he said quietly. "This was the system." Outside, reporters had gathered outside the courthouse like moths to floodlights. Flashbulbs burst when Marcus stepped through the revolving glass doors. Dozens of microphones extended like arrows. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Wynn, what do you hope to gain from this lawsuit?" He paused. "Dignity doesn't need protection," Marcus said calmly, his voice steady in the cool autumn wind. "It demands it." He didn't wait for a follow-up. He walked past the crowd, through the marble entryway, and into the legal process he had quietly orchestrated for weeks. Inside courtroom chambers, Fairwing's legal team scrambled. Their lead counsel, an older man named Walter Doran, no relation to Rylan, was already briefing PR executives. "If we frame this as an isolated mistake, we may contain the spread," he said. "We need a face-saving offer, settlement, apology, diversity training pledge, the usual." But Marcus wasn't negotiating in the shadows. He wasn't filing a grievance. He was filing a civil rights and gross negligence lawsuit. The complaint was thorough. It listed not just the assault, but the culture that protected it, the suppression of prior complaints, the pattern of internal shielding. He had affidavits from 4 passengers. He had camera footage. He had whistleblower testimony, most likely from Caleb Vaughan, the junior flight attendant who hadn't said a word publicly but had done more behind the scenes than any headline would ever show. Daniel Crane stood beside Marcus at the press briefing outside the courthouse. "This isn't just about money," Daniel said. "We are demanding a corporate audit, restructuring of compliance protocols, and independent civil oversight for all in-flight staff conduct." Behind closed doors, the airline's board erupted into chaos. 2 senior executives, vice president of personnel and director of in-flight services, were quietly placed on leave. An internal investigation team was appointed, but Marcus's legal filings were already ahead of them. They weren't chasing the news cycle anymore. They were trapped in it. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Rylan Dorr pulled his curtains shut, breathing heavily as each news cycle expanded his shame. His name trended alongside words like disgrace, racist, and symbol of systemic rot. His phone rang, but he didn't answer. He no longer worked for the airline. He no longer had a uniform. All he had was silence. The boardroom at Fairwing filled with crisis consultants and speechwriters. "We need to say this isn't who we are," one executive insisted. Another snapped, "That line hasn't worked in 10 years. Still another whispered what everyone feared to say aloud. "What if this case becomes a movement?" Marcus didn't dwell on the chaos. He stayed silent, working behind the scenes with his team. He walked through every word of the filing with Daniel. He approved language for the press packet. He prepared to testify. He reviewed the old footage again, not to relive the wound, but to document the intent. His scar had become more than a mark. It was a record. And still, he never once called for Rylan's destruction. That would come if justice demanded it. But Marcus was after something larger, something permanent. as media outlets swarmed to cover the growing storm. A surprising development broke late that night. An anonymous former employee leaked an internal audit from 2 years prior, previously sealed, showing early complaints about discriminatory comments made by crew members, including Rylan. It had been buried. Now it was everywhere. Suddenly, Fairwing's narrative cracked wide open. They hadn't failed to act, they'd acted to conceal. The pattern was undeniable. The reckoning had begun. Back in his office, Marcus stood by the tall window, watching the city lights flicker against the glass. His reflection showed only the faint red mark across his cheek, fading now, but still visible. He touched the scar once and turned back to his desk. On the far corner sat the sealed pouch, the silver key, still labeled Exhibit A. His phone buzzed with another news alert. He didn't open it. He already knew. When a key draws blood, Marcus reflected, it also unlocks truth long buried. The moment the group messages were displayed on the overhead screen, the entire courtroom fell into a suffocating silence. There was no need for interpretation. The words were there in raw, unfiltered text, jokes, slurs, and comments written by Rylan Dorr himself, mocking passengers of color, referring to them as needy, fragile, and better off in coach. One message read, "Put him in his place with a smile." Works every time another carried a winking emoji and a caption. "Some people need a scratch to know who's in charge." No one laughed. Rylan sat slumped at the defense table, his suit wrinkled, face pale, the arrogance he once wore like a badge now reduced to twitching fingers and a trembling knee. The soft hum of the projector filled the room as the last slide faded to black. Judge Alden Worth cleared his throat and said, "Let the court record show that these messages were verified and extracted directly from the defendant's personal account, with timestamps consistent with the date of the incident." The prosecution rested its digital pointer beside the evidence stack and turned to Marcus Wynne, who sat with hands folded calmly, the faint scar on his cheek now fully visible under the courtroom lights. His composure hadn't shifted once, not through the cross-examinations, not through the weak apologies, and not through the defense's attempt to reframe the event as a moment of stress. But now he rose. There was no need for him to be called. He had requested to make his own statement. Permission had been granted. He approached the witness stand not like a man seeking revenge, but like one offering truth that refused to stay buried. "I won't take long," Marcus began, his voice steady, neither loud nor cold, "because this is not about a single cut. It's about the blade that's been sharpened for years." The jurors watched him, all 12 seated in still attention. Even the bailiff stood straighter. "I didn't ask to become a case study," Marcus continued, eyes sweeping the room, "but I understand now that stories like mine, stories involving harm that hides under the guise of accident, must be told, not for sympathy, for structure, for accountability." He turned slightly toward Rylan but didn't address him directly. "That key he used didn't just open a scratch on my skin. It revealed something systemic. And what you saw on that screen just now, those messages, that wasn't a slip of character. That was culture. That was comfort. That was someone who knew he could say those things and still expect protection." Rylan flinched, head down, fingers now gripped around the edge of the table. "My legal team found over a dozen incident reports where passengers, mostly Black, Latino, or South Asian, filed complaints about mistreatment by this man, and every time it was filed away as a passenger overreaction. Every single time." Marcus turned to the judge now. "I ask this court not just for justice in my name, but to set precedent. Because unless you hold systems accountable, these moments will keep happening. People will keep bleeding, some silently, some publicly, but all preventably." He stepped back, then paused. His tone softened. "Not everything breaks with a blow. Sometimes it breaks with permission." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. The judge held up a hand to still it. When Marcus returned to his seat, his attorney, Daniel Crane, gave a single nod. Nothing more. No smile. Just acknowledgement. The kind that said, "You've done exactly what you needed to do." The defense rose clumsily next, attempting to cast Ryland's behavior as the result of overwork and sleep deprivation. Mr. Dorr had just completed a triple shift, the lawyer explained, sweat forming at his temples. He was under emotional strain, lacked rest. This behavior, while regrettable, was uncharacteristic. But the prosecution struck hard and clean. Is that why he had time to joke about putting people in their place? Is that why the incident wasn't reported by him or his supervisor until passengers began posting videos online? There was no answer, only the sound of papers being shuffled and the subtle scrape of a chair leg against the linoleum floor. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed against glass doors. Protesters and supporters gathered alike. But within the court, no movement was needed. The damage had already been documented. The timeline was clear. The smirk Ryland wore after the attack, captured frame by frame in passenger footage, was not a man exhausted. It was a man emboldened. The final blow came in the form of a memo, retrieved by Marcus's team through legal disclosure, that showed how the airline's supervisory board had dismissed multiple internal reviews of crew conduct, citing reputation risk. A signature from an executive. A date. A stamp. Marcus didn't even look up when it was shown. He had expected it. As the final statements closed, the jury was dismissed for deliberation. It wouldn't take long. Ryland remained seated, his lawyer whispering frantically beside him. Across the courtroom, Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair and exhaled. He had told the truth, exposed the paper trail, and now he waited not just for judgment, but for change. When one of the jurors briefly turned to glance at him, Marcus met the gaze and nodded. "I didn't bleed because of an accident," he said quietly. "I bled because of approval." The courtroom fell still. Even Ryland lowered his gaze. Truth, once drawn, doesn't fade, it deepens. The gavel had barely struck the bench when the room erupted. The verdict was clear. Marcus Wynne had won. The court awarded him both compensatory and punitive damages, but the judgment extended beyond money. The airline was ordered to submit to an independent audit and implement mandatory cultural reform across all staff levels. It was a historic ruling, the kind that sent tremors through corporate boardrooms nationwide. But Marcus did not smile. As the reporters clamored outside and legal assistants exchanged congratulatory glances, Marcus remained seated in the courtroom, his hands folded, his eyes fixed ahead. Justice had been delivered, but the deeper wound lingered. Not his own, but the one he suspected lived inside the man who had started it all. There was still one door left to open. 3 days later, inside a small neutral mediation office tucked between glass-paneled law firms in downtown Mercerfield, Marcus sat alone at a metal table, waiting. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The room was clean but cold, as though stripped of all distractions to expose only truth. A carafe of water sat between two glasses. Neither had been touched. The door creaked open. Ryland Dorr entered hesitantly. He looked thinner, pale, wearing a loose shirt and dark slacks that hung on his frame like borrowed clothes. The smugness that once defined him was gone, replaced by something harder to name, something raw and unguarded. He carried nothing in his hands, not even pride. He sat down across from Marcus slowly, eyes flickering to the carafe, then to Marcus, then down to the table. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Marcus said, his voice even but not unkind. Ryland nodded faintly, his throat bobbing. "I didn't think you'd want to see me again." "I didn't," Marcus replied. "But I needed to." There was a silence that settled like dust, thick, heavy, unmoving. Ryland finally spoke, voice rough. If this is some kind of final humiliation— It's not, Marcus cut in, calmly but firmly. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folded document, setting it neatly on the table between them. This is. Rylan eyed the paper with caution. What is it? An invitation, Marcus said, pushing it forward. I'm launching a new initiative. For people who've done harm, but are willing to help prevent it from spreading. Rehabilitation, re-education, contribution. Rylan's brows furrowed in disbelief. You want me to help you? Marcus's expression didn't change. No, I want you to help yourself. And if that means helping others along the way, then maybe the damage can be more than a scar. Rylan blinked slowly, trying to process the offer. He shook his head, confused. After everything I did to you, why? Marcus's voice lowered, but his words rang with sharp clarity. Because you didn't just try to cut my skin, Rylan. You tried to cut my dignity, but in doing so, you exposed your own wound. I see that now. For a long moment, Rylan said nothing. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the document but didn't unfold it. He looked up, his eyes glassy. I never thought it would get this far. I was angry, bitter, and I blamed people who didn't deserve it. Marcus leaned back slightly, but his gaze didn't waver. Anger's easy. Accountability isn't. That's why I called this meeting. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. Outside, the sun had begun its descent, casting a faint orange hue through the blinds. Rylan studied Marcus's face, still marked faintly by the scar he had caused. It wasn't anger he saw now. It was something worse, something truer. Conviction. You don't owe me this, Rylan muttered. I know, Marcus said simply, but this isn't about debt. It's about direction. Rylan slowly unfolded the document, scanning the offer. His eyes lingered on the last paragraph, where it mentioned peer mentorship, public acknowledgement, and monitored community speaking events. His throat tightened again. What if I fail? He whispered. Then fail forward, Marcus replied. But you'll be watched. Held accountable. I'm not offering you freedom. I'm offering you the weight of responsibility. Rylan stared at the signature line at the bottom. His fingers hovered above it, unsure, unsteady. Marcus stood. You can take your time, he said, turning toward the door. But understand something, Rylan. You can't undo what you did, but you can help prevent others from doing worse. Rylan didn't respond. He simply nodded, once, sharply, as if anchoring himself to the moment. Marcus paused at the threshold, glancing back only once. Forgiveness, he thought, is the quietest form of justice. Months had passed since the courtroom lights dimmed and the last gavel struck, but the impact of what happened aboard that flight still echoed across boardrooms, service desks, and training halls nationwide. There was no forgetting the scar on Marcus Wynn's cheek, nor the silence that followed his final words in court. But for Marcus, the fight hadn't ended with a verdict. It had merely shifted arenas. In a packed auditorium at Synercore Systems headquarters, the air buzzed with anticipation. Rows of chairs filled with executives, educators, policy leaders, and frontline workers, all male, all watching as Marcus stepped onto the stage beneath the crisp glow of ceiling spotlights. Behind him, a large banner displayed bold silver lettering, the Open Key Initiative. There was no fanfare, no dramatic entrance music, just the quiet footsteps of a man who had turned assault into action. Marcus approached the podium in his navy blue tailored suit, the faint scar now a permanent feature on his otherwise composed face. He didn't need an introduction. His presence alone drew silence. Gentlemen, he began, his voice low but deliberate, we are not here to recall a wound. We are here because we know it cannot stay one murmurs of agreement stirred, but Marcus held up his hand. No applause, not yet, Today isn't about what was taken. It's about what we do with what's been revealed. He gestured behind him, and the screen lit up with a series of case study clips, scenarios drawn from actual incidents, anonymized but accurate. Flight attendants mocking passengers, hotel staff mishandling conflict, security officers stepping beyond boundaries under the veil of protocol. Each clip paused with a question. Could this have been prevented? What does accountability look like? What would you have done? Marcus turned back to the crowd. These are not just mistakes. They're moments when someone believed they were immune to consequence. From the front row, a figure stood, tall, broad-shouldered, and noticeably nervous. It was Rylan Dorr, clean-shaven now, dressed in a gray blazer, no longer hiding. Marcus gave a slight nod, inviting him to speak. The air thickened as Rylan stepped up to a side mic, voice low, posture humble. "I never expected to be here," he said, eyes scanning the crowd. "What I did was wrong. No excuse will undo it. But I'm here because Marcus believed that change means offering a path forward, not just drawing a line in the past." His hands trembled slightly as he held up a printed binder. This is the new service ethics manual I helped draft, not as redemption, as responsibility. The crowd remained still, digesting the weight of his words. Marcus returned to the mic. "The Open Key Initiative," he said, "is not about me. It's about recognizing that service is power, and power must come with reflection." The program they launched that day would travel across 42 states in its first year. It would embed ethical training into onboarding procedures for flight crews, hotel staff, transportation agents, and beyond. Former offenders were invited not to be shamed, but to share, to caution, and to shape. In one such session, held in a regional transit center in Ohio, Marcus sat quietly in the back row, watching, listening. A young trainer recited an incident not unlike Marcus's own, then paused. What could have stopped this from happening? "Seeing him as human," one man said. "Being taught that calm is not weakness," another added. Marcus wrote both answers down, not for a speech, for the future curriculum. Weeks later, the story reached national airwaves again. A popular evening show invited Marcus for a special segment titled After the Verdict. The studio was minimalist, just 2 chairs, soft lighting, and a single wide-angle shot that captured every breath. The host, a composed man named Nathan Geller, leaned in during the final stretch of the interview. "Mr. Wynn," he asked, "has the incident changed you?" Marcus paused. His eyes drifted to the camera lens, then to the faint scar that a makeup artist had offered to conceal but he'd refused. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that knew pain, but also purpose. "It didn't change me," he said. "It revealed what we're still capable of fixing." The camera panned out slowly, the image widening to include the office behind him. Framed on the wall, encased in glass, hung the silver key that had once drawn blood. It glinted under the studio lights, engraved with one line: "The key that opened more than a wound." Outside his window, beyond the skyline, aircraft traced pale trails across the sky, symbols of motion, distance, and new beginnings. The show was wrapping, the credits about to roll. Marcus leaned back in his chair, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "In a world that keeps flying forward," he whispered, "justice must never stay grounded." He cut a man's face to wound his pride, and moments later, the same key tore open his own disguise. If you believe every act of cruelty exposes its author, subscribe now, because justice always turns the key. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, arrogance, and the consequences of abusing power. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on justice, equality, and the importance of treating every person with respect.